Hello everyone, thank you so much for joining me today. My name is Lisa and I'm with Lisa Capen Quilts, and I have a project share video with you today. One of the things that I wanted to do throughout the fall and the holiday seasons was to make some holiday themed smaller projects that you could sit down in a couple of days or a good afternoon and complete a project from start to finish. I believe that this quilt is one of those types of projects. Now, if you are completely new to applique, I suggest you pause the video and go watch some of my previous videos where I do a complete tutorial on raw edge applique and using fusibles like Heat and Bond Light. This is not going to be a full tutorial, but yet a walkthrough of the instructions of assembling this quilt. I'm going to try to speed up the process in this video, and so I'm looking at maybe 30 to 40 minutes long on this walkthrough. There are instructions in this pattern that will take you step by step, but they're very simple and not long written out instructions, and so you could certainly follow the instructions to put this together. But if you're like me and like to see it done visually, then this video would be very helpful for this quilt. There are so many variations that you could do with this quilt. I've included in the instructions measurements to do patchwork. For your larger pieces like the sky in this quilt is all done with patchwork. I've also given measurements to do the moon as patchwork, all of the letters, and the grassy areas. So imagine all of the different looks that you could do switching up patchwork with solid pieces to do all of your quilt design. Now, I made this quilt as my prototype, and this is the one that's going to go on my table. And today we are going to be making this quilt here. And you can see that I added hangers to this quilt. So I'm going to show you how I did that in this video. If you've ever wondered how to get little hangers in your quilt to turn an art quilt into a wall hanging, then we will show you how to do that today. And you can see on this one I did a solid sky background and I did the patchwork on the letters. Isn't that cute? Again, the instructions will have measurements for all of your fabric requirements. This is a very easy finish. I did mine by just turning everything right side out. And you'll see that process in today's video. If you wanted to do a binding on your quilt, there will be measurements and fabric requirements for binding in the instructions. And so you certainly do not have to finish your quilt this way. You could add a binding and that would be great as well. I am excited to show you this walkthrough. If you have any questions, you can jump down to the comments section below this video and I will be glad to try and help you. Again, if you're new to applique, I do suggest checking out some full tutorials on how to stitch down everything. I did a satin stitch on all of my applique on this quilt, and in today's video I'm going to keep everything a raw edge and I'll be stitching all of my applique down in the quilting. And so that's certainly another way that you could finish your quilts and still get that quilted look and yet speed up the process. Okay, we're ready to go ahead and get started. Let's begin. We are going to begin today by taking a look at this pattern. This is a PDF pattern and I like using Adobe Reader to print off my patterns. If you don't have Adobe Reader, that is a free download on the internet if you're interested in checking that out. I will put a link to Adobe Reader in the description box of this video. So one of the reasons I like Adobe Reader is because it gives me several different options when it comes time to print off my patterns. For this pattern, I did choose the actual size setting when printing. If you are using a different program or you don't have the option to choose the size of your prints, then you might notice that your templates are a little bit smaller, and that's okay. You can certainly still use them, but they might be a slight bit smaller. So if you have the option to choose actual size, then go ahead and check that before printing. This pattern is several pages. However, I did consolidate a lot of the smaller template pieces within the larger template pieces. So it would have been more pages if I had not done that, but you'll notice that a lot of the pages have been consolidated. Like there's your little bat, and he's located within the grass template. I did include a pattern placement guide, and so this just gives you a rough idea of where to place your pieces. It can be helpful for when you have the background together and you're wondering about how to lay all of your pieces out. All of the templates have been mirror imaged, and so if you're doing a raw edge applique, you are ready to go, and you won't have to flip your pattern over and trace it on the back side. You are ready to begin with whatever type of fusible you are using. Now some of the pieces, you'll notice this little dotted line. They were too large to fit on one piece, and so the dotted line gives you a placement to tape your pieces together. You'll notice on the pieces that require assembly, I do have a little map that helps you line up everything and tape it together. Now the only things that have not been mirror imaged would be the grassy area, and we're going to walk through how to trace out that template here in just a minute. But that template is 3 pages and it has not been mirror imaged, and it looks like this. I'm going to show you using freezer paper today how I trace out my template for the grassy area, but that we do not want mirror imaged. So do not trace that on the back side. We are using it just the way it is printed. And there is a 1-page sheet of instructions and fabric requirements on the back. It gives you a simple, basic explanation on how to construct this project. But I thought it would be helpful to just walk you really quickly through all the steps in today's little project walkthrough. And so there we are. Let's see, let's go ahead and begin with the grassy area. I have already pre-cut my background according to the size requirements in the instructions, and I've pre-cut my grassy area as well. Now when you pre-cut your grassy area, that will be one large rectangle that we are actually cutting this shape out of. And so to do that, we're going to assemble the template, and I'm going to show you how I use the freezer paper. Of course, you could use printer paper as well. I like using the freezer paper because it's already large and I can cut it to the size I want, and because it fuses to my fabric as I cut out my template pieces. So let's begin with tracing out our grass template. We are ready to begin. You can see I have a large sheet of freezer paper laid out on the work table, and I have my 3 sheets for the grass template. I will start with the position number 1, and we will trace that out on the solid line. You could use copy paper if you wanted, or newsprint, something that you can see through in order to trace the template. And instead of fusing it like we will with the freezer paper, you could just pin it directly to your grass fabric and cut it out. When I trace out all my templates, I make sure to indicate the lines on the pattern. There's a large dotted line that helps you line up your next piece. And then there's a small dotted line, and that indicates where you will line up your grass fabric onto the sky area. So go ahead and make sure to mark that on your template as well. The freezer paper is very easy to see through, and we are marking our template out on the matted side, not the shiny side. The shiny side actually gets fused to our fabric. And I will trace out pattern number 4. Now once you have all 4 pieces traced out onto your paper, I'm going to do a rough cut around my template to eliminate a lot of the extra freezer paper, but we're not cutting out on the solid line yet. We are ready to begin fusing our template onto the grassy fabric. I am working from the pretty side of the fabric, so the right side. And I know this is going to be hard to see because my grass area is green and I have a green pressing board, so I do apologize for that. Working with a high cotton setting and no steam, I am just fusing the template onto the pretty side of the fabric. And this just takes a few minutes if your iron is nice and hot. Mine is not quite hot yet, but just simply go over your pattern and you will feel it grab onto your fabric. Don't worry, it just lifts off when you're done. Once you have all of your pattern template fused to your grass fabric, now is the time when you take some scissors and cut out your pattern piece directly on the line. Once you have your grassy area all cut out on the line and true to shape, we're ready to position that onto the pre-cut sky area. Now, if you have used patchwork for your sky area, this all works just the same. You might notice, depending on your print settings, that the sky area might stick out the two bottom corners from your grassy area. If that is the case, that's okay. Go ahead and take a pair of scissors and trim that flush so that both of these areas just blend in right together. All the print settings can be different, and so that might happen. I'm going to go ahead and lift off my freezer paper from the grass fabric and put that into position. And today I will be using school glue to glue baste my two pieces together. Don't worry, I do dry the glue with a hot iron before bringing this to the sewing machine, so everything is nice and dry. However, you could just pin this in place. That works just the same. We want to make sure that we do a zigzag or satin stitch to secure these two pieces together. And once that's done, we'll remove any excess of the sky area below the stitching. Now, before we go to the sewing machine and sew together our sky and our grassy area, I do want to create the illusion that the moon is rising up from beyond the grassy area. I've already glued my grassy area down into place, so I'm just going to do a few short little tugs on the grass fabric, just enough to tuck the moon up underneath of there. I'm using Heat and Bond Light on my smaller applique pieces, and so I can just fuse that into place and apply a little bit more glue to the grassy area. And we can finish fusing all of this down. Now, once your moon is into place and everything is nice and dry and fused together, we are ready to go to the sewing machine with this one large section, doing a zigzag or a satin stitch right along the area or the line where the grass meets the sky. Will secure this and make it one solid foundation. See how the moon tucks up underneath the grass? We are at the sewing machine now, and I'm going to be doing a satin stitch, so I will use some phone book pages as a tearaway stabilizer on the back of my work. You could do a zigzag stitch as well, and that would work perfectly fine. I'm just setting up my machine. We're going to start at one end of the quilt and stitch all the way to the other side. And the phone book page just acts as a really good lightweight stabilizer, making sure all of my stitches are nice and pretty as I go along. And we are stitching right at the top of the grassy area, and this will just lock everything right into place, creating one large background. I'm just going to show you a quick portion of this. When I come to the end of this phone book page, I just simply add another one as I stitch along. And you'll go all the way to the other side of the background. We are done sewing our grassy area to the sky and everything is nice and pretty. Once you have that done, you can trim away any extra of the sky area that extends beyond your stitching, and that just reduces any thickness in your quilt. We're ready to begin playing with the placement of the rest of our applique pieces. Now I'm going to show you what it looked like while I was making these letters. I will show you that in the upper right hand corner, some pictures of the patchwork assembly. And I'll also show you some pictures of when I assembled the sky area on my original quilt as well. If you need some good sit-down therapy time with your machine, then assembling some patchwork for this quilt could give you that much needed sewing machine time. Again, I am using Heat and Bond Light to apply all of my applique pieces today. The Heat and Bond Light, you surely do want to stitch everything down, whether it be a satin stitch or a zigzag stitch or a running stitch with your quilting, some kind of stitch, because it is not a permanent bond and it will not last forever. They do have a heat and bond and other fusible products that are permanent without stitching. So if you are extremely new and nervous about stitching all of these pieces, you could investigate a permanent fusible product. And I'm just having fun putting into position all of my pieces. Now, if you've done patchwork on any of these pieces and you're having an issue with the fusible product actually grabbing a hold of the fabric underneath of it, I'm going to show you a picture in the left hand corner here. If you lay a towel down on your pressing surface, it gives your seams a place to go and it helps the fusible actually do its job. And so I did end up having to go back and repress my letters with a towel to get them to really bond with the background. Here I'm just placing all of my windows and the crossbars for my windows. I love how the yellow fabric really pops on that black haunted house. The numbers, or you'll find numbers for the windows and the crossbars so that you don't get them mixed up. They are on the pattern. So when you're tracing all of those pieces out, it would be helpful to write on your pieces the numbers of the windows and the crossbars. Now for our little Casper the Friendly Ghost, you'll notice I'm applying him and he does not have his face yet. I'm going to do some free motion stitching with his face, but if you are uncomfortable with doing that, you could use a fabric marker, or you could hand stitch his face with some DMC thread, and that would be super cute as well. I just have these few little short pieces left to fuse into place, and then we're ready to move on. I'm ready to go ahead and make the hangers for my quilt today. I have a piece of cotton fabric here. I've pressed it and it is folded in half, and so this one cut that we do together will create a long strip of fabric. I would take my straight edge ruler and my rotary cutter and just square up this piece of fabric, and then slide over and do one more cut, and that will give us one long continuous piece of fabric to make our hangers from. Once that is cut, we will fold pretty sides together and sew a 1/4 inch seam along the raw edge from one end all the way to the other. Once you have everything sewn together, we are going to press the seam into the middle of our strip. So bring that seam allowance right to the middle, and you'll notice this is formed like a tube. The seam will go right in the middle as we press everything into place. I like to use a little steam and make sure everything's nice and flat. Continue pressing all the way to the end. And still pressing all the way to the end. This long strip will give you plenty of hangers. I think we're only going to use 4 of them in today's project. Once everything is nice and pressed flat, before we turn this tube, we are going to cut our hangers out. I like to cut mine about 6 inches long. And once they're cut, then I flip the right side out and repress, nice and flat. I will also fold it in half and give a good quick press. Now that we have all the components for our quilt ready to go, we're ready to make our layers. You'll notice lots of extra backing material if you want to use that as your binding. Today we're doing a quick finish. I've layered my batting down first, my backing down second with the pretty side facing up, and I just turned my quilt top pretty side facing the backing. Now, if you want to make your quilt into a wall hanging, do not forget to add your little hangers in between the backing and your quilt top towards the top edge. We're ready to start pinning all of our layers together. I use quite a bit of pins around the curvy section just to keep all of those pieces right exactly where I want them to be. And sometimes I'll add a few pins in the middle of the quilt to keep all the layers nice and in place. I'm going to pin the top area last. We'll come to the left side of the quilt, and if you are doing your quilt in this method, make sure to leave a space when you're stitching everything out so that you can turn this right side out when we're finished. Just going to add a few pins to the center of the quilt, turn everything around, and now I'm just going to measure out where I want my hangers, and I'm really only going to measure out the 2 on the ends. So I come about 2 inches away from the outside edge of the quilt, the left and the right, and I pin those 2 hangers down first. I like to use 2 pins to make sure that they stay in place really well. And then I eyeball the placement for the other 2. Now when you're pinning these, make sure the raw edge of your hangers are pinned to the raw edge of your quilt. Finish pinning and we're ready to go to the sewing machine. We are at the sewing machine now, and I know that it is hard to see the raw edge of my quilt top compared to my backing. So I do apologize for that. I am starting at the opening of my quilt, and I will do some back stitches to lock everything in place. I am sewing with a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around the edge of my quilt, removing the pins as I go. If you have a walking foot for your machine and you like using that, it would make this part of the process a lot easier. It would move all of the layers at one time. I've never been a fan of the walking foot that came with my machine, so I'm just using my 1/4 inch pressing foot and just manipulating all the layers as we go along. Again, removing the pins as we come to them. The straight edges are very simple to go along and stay exactly a 1/4 inch away from the seam. Once you get to the corners, stop with the needle in the down position and pivot your work around and continue on. And now we're coming down to the bottom edge that has all of the little curves. You'll notice I like to stop periodically and shift my work so that I get nice rounded corners and curves. Still stitching along. Continue stitching around those curves. I wanted to bring you along throughout this whole stitch out so that you can see how you will have to manipulate all of these layers as you're stitching around. Once you're done stitching around all of the perimeter of your quilt, you can go ahead and take some scissors and trim away all the extra batting and backing material. And then we're ready to flip our quilt right side out. I do like to trim the corners of my quilt so that they are more pointy. Just be careful not to trim through your stitching when you do that. Being very careful as I pull everything out, because I did not stitch down all of my applique before layering my quilt and stitching it. I do have some of my pieces that are popping loose. I will just repress those and stick them right back down. I love the little quilt hangers that are sewn into our quilt. Those are turning out fantastic. And I take my fingers and poke out the corners and then run along the curvy edges at the bottom and get that seam nice and exactly right. And then once you have everything nice and turned, go ahead and flatten it all out. I like to take my iron and go around and press around the whole perimeter of my quilt and flatten everything right down. And don't forget, we still have our opening where we turned everything. I take and turn the raw edge under on both the top and the backing material. And I like to use a little bit of Elmer's glue just to keep it there while I hand stitch it shut. You could also do a straight line all the way around the edge of your quilt to stitch close the opening. I'm at the sewing machine now and we're ready to stitch down and quilt our quilt all at the same time. Now if you've done a satin stitch on your applique before creating your layers, then you do not have to go around the perimeter of each one of your pieces like I'm doing in today's video, unless you want to quilt around each one of your pieces. Now I do have my quilter's gloves on, and that just gives me some grip on my fabric. I have a very small throat space on my machine, and so I'm just really wanting to show you that even if your machine is small like mine, a quilt this size can certainly be quilted on your machine. It just takes some finagling and some patience. I'm going to go around the perimeter of all of my letters first. We want to start in the center of the quilt and work our way to the edge of the quilt. And that'll make sure that everything is quilted nice and flat. So I'm just going around the perimeter of my first letter and stitching all of that down. And then to quilt it, I will do some stitch in the ditch on this particular letter and work my way to the center and make sure that the raw edge of the center of the O is nice and stitched down. Each one of my letters I do a little bit of a different quilting on, and so I'll just take you through the process of each one of these pieces as we get them stitched down and quilted. Now you could certainly use your walking foot to do some straight quilting on this quilt as well. We're moving on to the second letter, and I've already stitched around the perimeter of this letter, and all of the edges are nice and locked down with the stitching. And I'm just going to do some meander stitching to quilt down this letter. Again, the quilting is totally up to you on how you would like to quilt your quilt. just thought I would bring you along for the process of this one so you can see how it all looks. I am much better quilting on my long arm versus my sewing machine here. However, I wanted just to show you that it doesn't matter what kind of machine you have. You can certainly do free motion work on your domestic sewing machine as well. It just takes practice. Staying true to quilting all of the center first, we're stitching the last letter. I've already gone around the outside perimeter of my letter B. And as I do the quilting and I come to the center of the letter, I will stitch down those raw edges as well. And continuing on with a meandering stitch with the letter B. You can see that sometimes I grip the quilt itself to help move it underneath of the machine. And as I come to the opening up at the top of the letter, I'll go around that raw edge as well. Now that our letters are done, I've put black thread through the machine and I'm going to stitch down the haunted house. So you'll see me go around the perimeter and the raw edge and stitch everything down. One of the reasons I like doing this raw edge stitching while I'm quilting is it really does speed up the process of making the quilt. And I'm actually quilting as I'm stitching down my pieces. Sorry for the background noise. Popcorn says hello. Again, we're just going around all of the perimeter of the house. You could use a straight stitch. I think it would just take a little bit longer because you'll be turning the fabric a lot. Once the perimeter is done, I'm going to move to the windows and do a couple passes around the edge of the windows. And one reason I like to do this, it kind of looks like they have been sketched on. I really like the look of that. And I will stitch my crossbars down at the same time. And while we're right here, I'm going to show you one of the bats as well. Since we have black thread running through our machine, I thought we could go ahead and put in the face on our ghost. I'm going to use a heat disappearing pen and just sketch in his eyes and his mouth. Now this does not have to be exact, and you can get creative with it as much as you would like. And because these markings do erase with an iron, I'm not really worried if I go outside of the lines. Once I start stitching, I just go around each one of the lines a couple passes, and the more times you go around, the more darker and the more bold your lines are. And when I'm done, I just jump to the next place I want to stitch, take a couple of stitches in place, and continue on. Now this only just takes practice. It is a lot of fun to do free motion work. And basically it's just like drawing with your sewing machine. See, doesn't that look fun? Now we're ready to come in with some white thread and stitch down our moon area. So you'll see I'm going along the raw edge all the way around this circle, securing our moon applique. Right close to that edge. And once the raw edge of that piece is all stitched down, You can use any kind of quilting stitch that you would like to quilt in your moon area. I'm just doing a haphazardly meander stitch as we fill in all of the moon, being careful not to go over the little bats or the house area with my white thread. And at this point, the quilt is starting to lay down nice and flat and starting to become a little bit easier to work with. Just continue stitching and quilting. Since we have the white thread already through our machine, we will take and jump down to the ghost area and stitch around the perimeter of our little ghost, stitching him down and quilting this portion of our quilt all at the same time. Of course, now Pepper says hello. They always know when I'm making a video. I will use the same white thread to stitch down and quilt the little graves. Stitching one at a time and jumping from one grave to the other. And this is our last one. Once the moon is all quilted down, we can jump down to the grassy area of our quilt. I'm just going to start at the edge and start doing a larger meander stitch all through my grassy area. Being very careful when you are working along the outside edge of your quilt. Of course, Bethany's bird says hello as well. I just go through and enjoy the quilting process in this grassy area. This quilt is really good if you want to practice doing free motion work on your machine. Once again, I have black thread in my machine and I'm ready to quilt the sky area. Again, another reminder to be very careful along the outside perimeter of your quilt. And then we'll fill in all of the sky area with a larger meandering stitch. Also remember to be very careful and go a little bit slower when you come to your corners and where your hangers are sewn into the inside of your quilt. And here we are. This is the one that we've made together. This is the wall hanging that has the little hangers that you could fit a good sized dowel or rod through and hang this one up on the wall. I showed you a little bit of the quilting throughout the whole process. This was a lot of fun. I do think because I did an unfinished edge on all of my applique, that if I handle this quilt a lot or I wash it, then the raw edges on my applique will fray. I'm one who really loves the look of the frayed edges. However, if you do not like that look, then I do suggest doing a more finished edge like this one here. Before I made my layers, I did do a satin stitch around all of my applique, so it can be very finished like this one. Or you could just do a raw edge like this one and stitch everything down. I absolutely love this project. I would love to see your quilts. If you make this quilt, you can share your pictures at my Facebook. I'll have a link below in the description box to my Facebook or my quilty group over there on Facebook. It's been so much fun. If you have any questions about this project, you can jump down to the comment section below this video and I'll try to be timely in getting back with you. It's been a lot of fun. I hope you enjoy this small little project. Something to be festive during the Halloween season. Thank you all so much for watching and we will see you next time. Bye.